We are both programs of the Open Society University Network, which is a global consortium of liberal arts colleges sharing resources and ideas, and really focused on issues of democracy, censorship, among many other important things. So what I'm going to do is share a little bit about our program, Worldwide Climate and Justice Education Week, and say a little bit about why we felt like it was important to convene a specific webinar on these topics of censorship and culture wars. Then I'm going to introduce Natalia, who's going to share a little bit about Black Mountains College. And then we are going to have two fabulous speakers, one from the US, one from the UK. Throughout all of this, please feel free to put in questions in the chat. I'm going to try to synthesize some of those at the end for Q&A. And I think we should have a really interesting chat where our different contexts can come together and we can kind of see how things are similar and different around the world. In the US and UK, but of course, where everyone else is coming from. I think it should be really interesting. So with that, I'm gonna share my screen. Cool, can everyone see this? Give a thumbs up, great. So this is our website for the Worldwide Climate and Justice Education Week. I will put the link in the chat after, but what we are is a global initiative encouraging folks to organize interdisciplinary climate learning, climate events, climate classes during April 1st through 8th, which is the first week of Earth Month. The idea is that, climate education is for all of us, not just climate experts or people in sustainability programs, and that if we really want to address the climate crisis at the scale that science and justice demands, all of us need to be thinking and acting on climate, whether you're an economist, a writer, an artist, a chemist, a scientist, et cetera, et cetera. So with that, we have two initiatives that we work with folks to do. It's Make Climate a Class, which is an initiative to spend just 30 minutes in your class, no matter the subject, talking about how climate solutions and climate justice pertain to your course subject. To sign up for that, you would click this pledge, Make Climate a Class, and then Make Climate an Event, which is a call to do interdisciplinary climate learning during that week. Though it's flexible, you can do it, after or before. We've had folks do climate theater projects, climate art projects, interdisciplinary panels. Last year, we had over 50,000 students participate. And you can already see in this year for 2024, our global map. This is in the US where we have a lot, but we also have great participation in Africa, Europe, India, Asia, South America. So it's really a call for shared action, a sense of synchronous action during the first week of Earth Month, which we are dubbing Worldwide Climate and Justice Education Week. I'm going to stop sharing. So the reason that we felt compelled to do this webinar in relation to our work is we have similar webinars every week about different topics. And I was noticing an uptick even from last year when I started working on the project, folks expressing concern about reprimand and pushback about participating in our program. Oh, I teach, high school English. I feel like there's going to be some sort of pushback or I'm going to get punished for doing this. And I really noticed a real uptick. So we thought it would be of value to address this explicitly, see what strategies there are for navigating this, and hope that with that in mind, we can encourage more folks to engage in this program beyond just having this hour to explore these timely and interesting topics. So that's us. With that, I will introduce Natalia from Black Mountains College, who's co-organizing this, who can just share a little bit about her work.
Great, thank you, Tobias. Hello, everyone. I'm Natalia. I'm from Black Mountains College. We are based in Wales, United Kingdom, and we are a new college, new and emerging, entirely set up to teach people how they can take climate action and how they can start adapting to a climate change world. So we run vocational courses in very practical skills like horticulture and coppicing. We also have unaccredited short courses for adults in a range of topics. And we've got one degree program, which is called Sustainable Futures, Arts, Ecology and Systems Change. And the main feature of that program is that there is a large emphasis on kind of practice-based outdoor learning. We have a farm, or the college is based on a farm, which the students use, where we teach outside as well as indoors in kind of seminar spaces. But the idea is that they can start applying what they learn directly into the real world, and they learn from nature and in nature. And the other large emphasis is that we are interdisciplinary, so that means that we're not just creating connections between different sciences, but there's a huge kind of integration of the arts within that program as well. So in the context that we're having, in the context of the conversation for today, so I was really excited by Tobias's invitation to be part of this, because I guess as a college, we've decided that we needed to set up a new educational institution in order to entirely do what we think is necessary. And we get a lot of academics that either work with us or that approach us that feel very, very excited about Black Mountains College, because they equally feel that their academic job doesn't quite align with their values anymore. Either because they feel that the academic environment doesn't help them to teach in a way that they think really benefits students, or because they feel that they can't be the kind of activist that they think they should be in the face of the climate crisis. So they can't be activist or outspoken or community engaged enough, or because they don't really see their green values reflected in the wider institution or in the management. So they're kind of looking for different ways of being academic activists, and then they often flock to us. But I guess it's really important to have the conversations about how we can work within existing educational institutions to be true radical educators in this time of climate crisis. So yes, I'm very pleased that so many of you have joined today, and I'm really looking forward to hear from the speakers and to hear all of your experiences from these different parts of the globe. What are your practices, examples within this field? And enjoy this 1 hour that we have together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. So with that, we're going to introduce our first speaker, Blake Touche, who has taught middle school, high school, and undergraduate biology and environmental sciences in Louisiana, most recently serving as science master teacher for Lafayette Parish School District. He earned a BS in secondary biology education from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette and an MS in biology from Mississippi State University, and completed his EDD in educational leadership, concentrating in curriculum at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He has worked on state and district committees for developing curricula assessments and mentoring science teachers. And he is a science education specialist at National Center for Science Education, really the organization on the forefront of issues of climate education and censorship in the United States. So with that, we're really excited to have Blake here, who's gonna impart his analysis and wisdom for all of us. So welcome, Blake.
Hi, thanks, Tobias. And I'll just go ahead and share my screen so that we can jump right into it. As Tobias said, I work with the National Center for Science Education, and being a teacher for over a decade in Louisiana, I've kind of seen everything that that can be thrown at climate denialism and things like that. Louisiana is a very conservative state. And a lot of our economy is run through oil and natural gas. But the National Center for Science Education, we have three main programs. One is catalyzing action, so looking at state standards adoptions, looking at policies and legislation that's being passed in different states that directly impact science education. We have a science research arm where we look at kind of what are science teachers teaching about things like evolution and climate change? What do those practices look like in the classroom? And then we have our supporting teachers program, which I work with, where we develop short, flexible curriculum modules to help teachers address misconceptions about evolution and climate change and give professional development, regarding how to resolve misconceptions. So what I was going to do today is kind of give you a snapshot of what does climate education in the U.S. look like right now, in the K to 12 world. And I wanted to start with kind of this question of what do parents and teachers want, and how do we know? So there have been lots of studies and polls that are very consistently showing that the overwhelming majority of parents and teachers want climate change to be taught in schools. So over 85% of teachers and over 75% of parents want their students learning about climate change in public education. So that kind of leads to two questions. Why is this not happening? And what can we do to make it happen? The first kind of piece to this puzzle is state standards. So in the United States, education is controlled at the local level. So each state adopts particular standards for each content area, and these standards kind of control what should be taught in each grade level and subject area, and might give some guidance on how those things will be taught. So NCSE worked with the Texas Freedom Network a few years ago to kind of give a report card to score how well each state standards are addressing climate change. So you can see that the states in green are doing really well. They have standards that cover climate change adequately. The states that are in pink and purple are not doing so well. However, there is good news. Since this study was published a few years ago, 3 states, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and South Carolina, have adopted standards that do a much better job of covering climate change. So we would hope that this map would be all green, but it's not yet. However, it is getting there. So kind of the first key takeaway from this snapshot is that states are adopting more rigorous and inclusive climate change standards. It's just going to take some time for each state to review and revise and adopt these new standards. But the Next Generation Science Standards, which was kind of a national initiative based on the framework for K-12 science education, is helping with this. We're seeing a lot more states adopt these more rigorous climate change standards. The second piece to the puzzle is, now that we have states that have rigorous climate change standards, that doesn't necessarily mean that all students are learning about this topic. So the next piece is value and placement of climate change education in the K-12 curriculum. And what we see is that only 2 states, as of 2018, require a year-long Earth or environmental science course as a graduation requirement. And only 8 states have a requirement that some study of Earth or environmental science concepts are required for graduation. So this is a problem, and this means that for a lot of students, Earth or environmental science courses in high school are only an elective. They're not a required course. So for a lot of students in the United States, middle school science might be the last time that they ever have an opportunity to learn about climate change. A lot of states do require biology or life science as a graduation requirement. But because there are so many other life science standards that are in those courses, there's not a guarantee that those teachers are going to be able to make meaningful connections to climate change. Or if they are, they might not have enough time in their curriculum to fully cover the causes, effects, and possible solutions of climate change in those courses. So this, again, is hopeful because it's something that stakeholders, parents, teachers, students, community members can take action on. So, you can talk to local representatives and say, we want climate change to be required for high school graduation. Talk to teachers and say, we want you to teach about climate change and make these connections for students, even if it's not required. So that's, there's some room for hope there that a change can be made. The next piece to the puzzle is, so we have these state standards, we have some teachers who are teaching climate change, So again, NCSE worked with a few other organizations and researchers to put out a study of what does climate change education look like in the K-12 classroom. And we found that about 71% of science teachers across the board are including some climate instruction in their courses. So that's a positive thing. However, they're not teaching nearly enough. So you can see that on average, the mean number of hours taught about climate change was just over 4 class periods. But if we look at the median, it's only about an hour and a half of climate instruction. So an hour and a half is not nearly enough for students to learn about all of the mechanics, the causes, the effects, the possible solutions, regarding climate change. And if we look a little deeper and ask, what are those teachers who are teaching climate change actually including in their instruction? This question was very interesting. We asked teachers, when I do teach about climate change, I emphasize either the scientific consensus that humans are the primary cause of recent global warming, or I teach that many scientists believe that recent global warming is due to natural causes. So when we saw their responses, a good thing, a positive note, is that over half are teaching the scientific consensus that humans are the primary cause of recent global warming. About 5% are not teaching either. So this means they're completely avoiding the topic and not teaching about climate change. About 10% are teaching students that most scientists believe that recent global warming is due to natural causes. And what's most interesting to me and a lot of other science education researchers is that about 31% were teaching both, that scientists agree that humans are causing recent climate change and that scientists agree that recent climate change is due to natural causes. So this means that a big chunk, almost a third of science teachers are sending students mixed messages. So they're kind of teaching both sides or strengths and weaknesses, and then leaving it up to the students. And when we asked, why is this happening? Why are nearly half of science teachers avoiding, denying, or sending mixed messages? A lot of the evidence points to a lack of teacher preparation. So what I have circled in red here shows that almost 90% of science teachers in the US have never taken a full college course dedicated to climate change. So if they are not learning about climate change in their preparation, how are we expecting them to teach students about climate change? So that's a big problem. And about 85% of science teachers have not taken a continuing education course about climate change after their certification. So the big takeaway number 3 is that many teachers are avoiding, denying, sending mixed messages about climate change, or not teaching nearly enough about climate change. And a lot of this can be contributed to lack of teacher preparation. So again, at the university level, are we including a climate science course in science teacher preparation programs? And if not, can we advocate for this inclusion so that science teachers are prepared to teach students about climate, both on the content side and the pedagogy side? Or can we provide more directed professional development opportunities so that if they didn't get it in their teacher preparation, can we give it to them after so that they're prepared to teach about it? The fourth piece to the puzzle, I'm assuming most of you are here, you're very aware of all of the misinformation and disinformation in the media. So there are so many different aspects of climate misinformation and disinformation, and they are constantly changing. So students, as you saw previously, on average, get very few hours of climate science instruction in the classroom, but they are kind of inundated with climate misinformation and disinformation in the news, in social media, across popular media. So one thing that all teachers can do, regardless of their content area, regardless of whether they're teaching about climate change or not, is to teach students how to analyze sources, teach them how to critique arguments, teach them how to look for is this valid and reliable? So all of those media and data literacy skills that can be taught in science, in social studies, in English, in math, kind of across all content areas. So this can be very helpful. So again, a lot of teachers are not prepared to do this because it's not a part of their preparation. So targeted professional development to teach teachers of all content areas how to give their students these tools to evaluate information for validity and reliability, and to critique arguments of others. And kind of my last takeaway, which kind of really leans into censorship, is what are the pressures that science teachers in the US are experiencing? So you can see in this survey here, we asked, have you received pressure either to teach or to not teach about recent global warming? And we see that only about 4.5% of science teachers have received pressure to not teach about climate change, which is less than the amount of teachers who have received pressure to teach about climate change. And what we see in multiple studies is that there's a large perception that there will be conflict. So the studies range from 20 to 25% of teachers think that if they bring up the topic, they're going to get pushback from parents or students or community members. But in reality, we see that fewer than 5% actually receive pressure. So there's a large perception of controversy, a large fear of controversy that's not manifesting in reality. And for my doctoral dissertation, I actually studied administrators. So I asked, what do administrators think about these socially controversial topics like climate change? And the numbers were similar. So about 20% of administrators thought that climate change would be an issue if it were taught, but fewer than 2% of administrators had ever received any pushback from students or parents over the course of their entire career. So a lot of what we're seeing regarding climate censorship is not direct censorship with states or school districts having policies saying you cannot teach about climate change. It's a lot of self-censorship on the part of administrators or teachers who fear that some kind of pushback is going to happen. So they censor themselves. They minimize the topic, they avoid the topic, or they teach both sides, as we saw in that, that previous study. And this has actually become a little more frequent in states like Georgia and Florida, who have passed kind of anti-CRT legislation, or anti-social justice or anti-diversity, equity, inclusion policies. So some science teachers think that if they are teaching about climate change in a appropriate, accurate way where they're talking about the effects of climate change, solutions, climate justice, that they will be penalized because it falls under that umbrella of DEI instruction or CRT instruction, as some states are labeling it. So again, this kind of falls into more of that self-censorship, where teachers think, if I talk about this, I will get in trouble. So they just minimize it or avoid it that way. But there are lots of tools and resources that teachers and administrators have at their disposal, like position statements from scientific and science teaching organizations that say climate change is happening, humans are the cause of it. We think it should be included in K-12 education. So I wanted to end with saying that at NCSE, we have developed some lessons, like I said, short, flexible lessons that address climate change and specifically misconceptions that students might have about climate change. So I'd be happy to answer any more questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Blake. Yeah, very, very useful to have that data and in your own experience navigating this. So now we're going to hop across the pond and for a different context, mainly more higher education with James Dyke, who's an academic, writer, and author. He's an associate professor in Earth Systems Science at the University of Exeter, where he serves as the assistant director of the Global Systems Institute and deputy director of the Environmental Intelligence Center for Doctoral Training. James is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a fellow of the European Geosciences Union, and serves on the editorial board of the journal Earth System Dynamics. He's an environmental columnist for UK newspapers such as and has written over 100 articles for international publications that include The Ecologist, The Guardian, The Independent, and The Conversation. His book, Firestorm and Flood, The Violence of Climate Change, was published in 2021 by Bloomsbury imprint, head of Zeus. So we are very thankful to have you, James, and hear your analysis. So with that, everyone, James Dyke, thanks.
Thank you very much for that very extensive introduction, and also for inviting me today. And also thank you, Blake, for that really interesting insight into education in the United States. I'd like to think things are a lot better in the UK. My perspective is higher education. And I've actually come to the conclusion that it probably is better, but the trajectory, the path on which we're traveling on doesn't leave me feeling very optimistic at times. So I've got no slides. I'm just going to talk for a few moments, if that's okay. I'm all slided out. I've done my teaching. So I would like to think that I might be at the opposite end of the spectrum that perhaps Blake was talking about earlier. I think there was a message about somebody was surprised about Florida. I wasn't surprised at all about Florida, because I guess I might have some understanding of the kind of politics down there. But where I am in Exeter, which is in the southwest of England, we have the Global Systems Institute, we have a climate dynamics group, we have the UK's Meteorological Office. We sometimes say we've got the greatest concentration of climate scientists anywhere in the world, and that's put on the front of our brochures and the kind of the publicity material, and we seem to be quite proud of that. So what I've also discovered, though, over about a decade now of writing and journalism, is that we've got to be wary of this kind of information deficit model. The idea, and I don't think many academics actually believe this anymore, but the idea that in order for us to affect change, in order for us to avoid dangerous or potentially catastrophic climate change, what we need to do is inform the public. We need to give them information. There's a deficit of information. And as academics, as knowledge generators, our role in society is to give society that knowledge. We do that kind of directly and indirectly through the work that we produce and the work that we publish. And also a very important route is through our education. The thousands of young people that come through and spend some time with us, and the opportunities we have to educate them about what we think the climate and ecological crisis is. Now, over that decade of, let's say, more kind of public facing work, I have received countless messages from people essentially trying to convince me that climate change is a scam or it's not real, or there's a number of reasons why people do this. They are genuinely they genuinely hold these convictions. Sometimes they are trolls and bots, and sometimes they're just trying to cause mischief. I'm just going to put something in the chat, which is a website called Skeptical Science that you've probably come across, or many of you have come across already, which is a very, very efficient way of being able to deal with the typical kind of talking points that you get. Because even after a decade of this, I still receive messages which are quite surprising. Oh, there's a new conspiracy theory. There's this other argument that was that's being proposed. And rather than me having to do the work to try to understand what that argument is and effective ways to counter it, then probably Skeptical Science is already on the list. And I've also used that in my education, in higher education, but then also in some of the work that we might do with our schools and colleges, because sometimes these things do arise. Blake alluded to something that briefly when we were waiting to start the call, I described as fossil fuel soft power. This idea of self-censorship. It's certainly not as bad in the United Kingdom as it might be prevalent in certain schools and certain states in the United States, but it absolutely does It absolutely does exist. And so what I wanted to do is spend the rest of my time just briefly talking about that, because I think some of the observations that we have in the UK would be applicable to the United States and other places around the world, and not just in a higher education context as well. The issues that I think that we've got is that there are certain things that we can talk about with regards to climate change, and there are things that we cannot. And it kind of goes through a kind of a scale. That the things that we can be quite confident about, or confident in our abilities to talk about and also provide education about, are the hard sciences, the natural sciences, the physical sciences. The fact that we can reconstruct surface temperatures, that we can reconstruct, paleoclimate, that we can produce certain models, that we can produce certain scenarios and outputs. And it's a very kind of dry, scientific, states or it claims to be objective, it wants to be objective, in part because of a response to decades of pointed attack by fossil fuel interests. And as a consequence of that, the climate science community has become incredibly conservative about what it will say and what it won't say. It tends to always want to maintain a consensus, and it likes to stick to the facts and doesn't want to speculate beyond them. But then, of course, information deficit models accepted, that's really not going to do much in and of itself. And it's got to the point now, after decades of delay, when there's practically no carbon budget left for 1.5, and we seem to be still hurtling towards past 3 degrees Celsius. We are in, however you want to describe it, it's a climate and ecological crisis, it's a climate and ecological emergency, it's an existential threat. There's increasing recognition and understanding that the current trajectory, the current series of solutions and approaches are just grossly insufficient, right? At the moment, we seem to be entertaining an overshoot scenario where we're going to significantly exceed 1.5 and probably 2, maybe 2.5, and then carbon dioxide removal is going to drag us all back down to safety by the end of the century. And what I found is that's an incredibly dangerous presentation of what the climate and ecological crisis is, but it's one that's actively supported by many academics and many academic institutions because of, I would argue, fossil fuel soft power or vested interest soft power, because the alternatives to that, the alternatives would be ones in which we consider whether or not these kind of technological approaches are really safe or appropriate. There would be ones in which we'd have to think much more critically about how we're going to allocate the very, very rapidly diminishing carbon budgets. We're going to have to think about beyond the science, beyond the engineering, and into the domain of what people might want to consider or call climate justice, or it's close neighbor social justice, and that's where people would get quite uncomfortable about. There's an awful lot of pressure within academia to stay in your lane, to not speak out about matters that you're not considered to be an expert within your very, very narrow discipline. Because now academics are so incredibly specialized, that means you're only really allowed to talk about a very, very small number of things. And there's quite strong prescriptions to be policy prescriptive, unless it's a policy which is essentially, it's a policy which is essentially the status quo, right? There's this constant argument or perception that I get, which is that you can't be political. Certainly academics can't be political. Natural scientists, physical scientists, earth system science have no business talking about carbon budgets and what that might mean in terms of climate justice. And so they would always argue they don't take a position. But not taking a position is still taking a position. It's just a position which is happy with the status quo. And there's no reflection about that positionality, and there's no reflection about that responsibility that many academics and academic institutions have, because there's a responsibility that comes from academics still being some of the most trusted members in society. So when you rank, who do citizens trust and who do they not, I can guess you got a pretty good guess at who's going to be at the bottom of that list, right? And towards the top, it's going to be teachers, it's going to be educators, it's going to be medics, and that includes university, higher education academics. So there is tremendous amount of power and potential agency that academics and academic institutions have in order to try to move the dial, move the discussion beyond these very kind of narrow and tightly framed discussions around net zero, and invoking what I think are just dangerous fantasies of future technological salvation. Unfortunately, the kind of landscape, certainly the funding and financial landscape that we operate under, makes that incredibly difficult. It seems like every other week I'll receive another call from the national funding bodies or international funding bodies that want me to research carbon dioxide removal. And in the not too distant future, there's going to be large calls for geoengineering, because when the carbon dioxide removal technologies don't emerge in time, then it's going to be probably a desperate scrabble for geoengineering. But there's very little, or there's nothing like as much promotion and support for new economic thinking, or potentially quite novel and new, you might want to describe, radical kind of social theory. And that work always happens, it always has happened, but it doesn't have anything like the kind of profile and exposure or platform that the very mainstream technological growth optimizing kind of IPCC type reported scenarios have us. So this further moves us down towards the trajectory in which we're becoming ever reliant on these kind of technological solutions and all that it invokes. So that's one thing, right? So I could spend the rest of the day, and it feels like the rest of my academic career, doing this, but I also just wanted to mention something else, which is the role of the university as a nexus for social change. Because obviously, if you're thinking about the climate and ecological crisis, if you take seriously statements such as this changes everything, and so it needs a radical departure from business as usual, where in societies are we going to see the generation of that kind of knowledge? Where are we going to see the new thinking? Where are we going to see that kind of intellectual innovation? If it's not on a university campus, then I really must ask you, what do you think a university campus is for? And it's no good just generating the knowledge. We then need to think about how would that knowledge react? What happens when it confronts reality? And that's why you see through countless examples, student activism and student protest as being really important generators of not just the knowledge, but actually the implementation. And this is where things become really quite dystopian in the United Kingdom, because we currently have a government which has been in the process of increasingly criminalizing peaceful protests. We are increasingly jailing and putting into prison, and sometimes for a number of years, actions that not so long ago would have just been considered to be the lifeblood of a well-functioning democratic country, which is the ability to protest. And these are issues which are happening now on our campus themselves. So there has been some recent protests at the University of Exeter, and as a consequence of that, one of those protesters has now been banned from the campus grounds essentially forever. There have been instances where UK universities have been hiring private investigators to monitor potential students for their possible involvement in protesting and activism. It's a kind of increasingly corporate, and I would argue neoliberal sort of higher education sector, which is terrified of protests and disruptive social change, because it, in some respects, I think they've lost the institutional memory of how to deal with that. 30, 40 years ago, protests were always on campus. Every week there was someone protesting about something. There was this almost expectation that young people would be difficult, that young people would be the grit in the machine rather than trying to be the oil. But decades of neoliberalism of education, further putting young people into debt, the competition for national and international students, has left a system which is much, much more like a market. It innovates in ideas regards to, you know, how they can make more money or increase their margins, but that means their ability to innovate socially has really atrophied. And so if there's one thing I'd like educators to think about is what positive role could we as individuals and also members of these institutions play in rediscovering some of that potential to generate ideas and maybe activism that could be considered radical, maybe even dangerous, in a peaceful, non-violent way. Because in the absence of that, then I really do worry that society continues to be asleep at the wheel. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, James. That was, yeah, really, really thoughtful and really inspiring, and resonates with me as someone who just left the university as a radical, but then during my time there, and hopefully now beyond. So I think that provided us a lot to think about in between these two contexts and these two perspectives. So I saw some questions in the chat that felt addressed in the chat. So I would love to open it up if anyone feels comfortable to asking your question aloud. If you can raise your hand, and please feel free to do so, and I'll call on you. And of course, feel free to ask your question in the chat still. Does anyone want to raise their hand and speak to our two wonderful guests? It looks like we have a question from Marek. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thanks, Tobias. I got a question for James and also for Blake. James, can you share one specific strategy that has worked for you on your campus with your academic colleagues? Something that you were able not only to envision, but enact, and that made, like, pushed this resistance to the status quo like one step forward. Anything that has worked for you? Because I'm familiar with a lot of grand vision initiatives, and most of these are so fantastic, so big that people get stuck in the first step. That there's a major gap between where we are and what we want to achieve, and there is a bunch of types of resistance and fight that are very honorable, but are almost always doomed to fail, which results in burnout, in all kinds of negative, hopeless reactions, and then people get stuck. So I'm interested in the kind of battles that we can win, even though it seems not enough, gradual, but something that we can actually do on our campuses.
If I could just go first, and I see Natalia's got her hand up, because I think one thing that people do is they do just give up. I know a number of academics who've just given up, right? They either go and teach for Black Mountains College, or they leave education entirely and they just do something else because they can't hold the tensions anymore, and they can't do it. My response has been, I think, beyond just denial. My response has been to build a community of students and like-minded staff, so it's not just me. And there's something tremendously empowering about being part of a community and helping build a community and seeing that grow. And then more specifically, here in Exeter, we're running a series of citizens' assemblies, so participatory democracy processes. We've even got the university to support us. Actually, we've got the Global Systems Institute to support us, and that's leveraging some of the power from some of the institutions within sub-institutions. And who's not going to support that? Who's not going to want staff and students to talk about in a deliberative and collaborative way how we want the university to function? I think the title of the first one is if you were in charge of the university, what would you do differently? And it's meant to surface a range of attitudes, ideas and opinions. And I think this is incremental buying in from the staff and students, and also getting them to believe that they are a community and they can affect change, to the point when you've got that critical mass where you can't be ignored, you must be engaged with in terms of the...
I don't want to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Natalia, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I wanted to give another example, which actually is very much in line with what James has said, around building community and staff and students working together. So there's an example of Falmouth University, which is close to Exeter, where they've created a module together, staff and students together, which is at the moment unaccredited and completely collaborative, in which the students set the content for the module and the staff is just there to support the session. And I think this has now led to a recognition from the university management that there's a demand for quite radical education like that, and they're going to support that financially, and then eventually hopefully make that into an accredited module as well. So this is entirely sort of ground up from students and staff, concerned students and staff working together and creating a space where they can voice themselves without any censorship around it, but which then clearly leads the way to more conventional ways of addressing climate within education. So that is another kind of inspiring, and like James says, a community-oriented approach where you work together to avoid complete burnout and despair. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Natalia. Blake, do you want to touch on this question of first steps?
Yeah, so I saw that someone put this in the comment section earlier, but as Catherine Hayhoe always says, the most important thing that we can do, that a normal person can do to address climate change, is to talk about climate change. And I think that is a big first step in, breaking down that perception barrier, because the media often kind of highlights that this climate debate is 50-50, or is more equal than it actually is. So I think that the more that parents and students and teachers and administrators talk about what they want and what they think should happen and what policies and practices should look like, the more those policies have a chance of actually passing. And the more a student says to their teacher, I want to learn about this, the more likely that teacher is to engage in some creative insubordination and find places to infuse climate education into their curriculum, no matter what it might be. So talking about it to everyone and encouraging others to talk about it is probably the biggest first step that any person can make.
Thank you, Blake. I want to move to Seth's question, but quickly want to plug some work that I've been involved in, inspired by what James said about citizens assemblies. BARD is becoming kind of a nexus in the States around participatory democracy and citizens assemblies. And actually at BARD, for our Climate and Justice Education Week, we will be having a kind of mock citizens assembly on the climate crisis. We'll have the participation of local government officials too. It's going to be like a mixing theater and policy. It's going to be really interesting. So I'm going to put the link to that work, and I'll put my email if you're interested in citizens assemblies and participatory government initiatives. Would love to talk to you about that. This is a passion of mine. Seth, your question.
Thanks, Tobias. I wanted to get some feedback on the approach that I used at my university. I was teaching at the American University of Central Asia, and I have a business background. And in business, we would say what we're dealing with is a change leadership or a change management problem. And a normal strategy is you have to work at the top level and the bottom level. The middle management people are very, very hard to change, but you can get change at the grassroots level. And if you can get the leadership at the top, then you squeeze them and you get things done. I was very successful, very lucky. The first president that I worked with was very receptive to the idea of creating a sustainable OUTSA task force. And the task force was deliberately designed to cover every element of the university: facilities, student behavior, teacher training, research, fundraising, etc. And so we had 35 people on this task force. We had a student club involved in this, and we sort of made it very quickly into the culture. Now, my question principally to Blake is this a model of this tops down, bottom up, a model that's being used? And are there case studies, or could there be developed case studies about how do you get a whole university engaged in this challenge?
So I think I'll kick that one to James, but I will say that, that model should be what we are trying to do in the United States, definitely, because of the way that education is structured in the United States. It's controlled by the state level, so we can hear voices from stakeholders like students and parents and teachers who are talking to their state legislatures about what science standards they want and what policies they want. And we can also kind of get initiatives that are coming from the federal government saying, include this, or we recommend that you include this. But really, it's down to the state level and who's controlling those education committees when standards are going up for adoption and things like that. So yes, I absolutely think a squeeze in that situation would be helpful. James?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd certainly advocate for these sort of, I think Delana Meadows called them, or no, Lynn Ostrom and Donella, like leverage points and polycentric governance, the idea that you can apply and try to affect change. And certainly it's bottom up and top down. And just to echo your comments around the middle bit, I've been surprised, I'm also frustrated around the perceived lack of agency with regards to academic middle management. They really do strongly limit what they think they're able to affect, and in many instances they you know, it rolls downhill, and that's I don't know why that is. It's something to think about, but there is I think there's tremendous opportunity from pushing it from the ground up as well. I mean, particularly if we're in some kind of market environment, if that's what the students want, right? If that's what they're calling for, then we should be responding. To what extent they are, and what extent the current quite transactional relationship with university education and education more generally, at least in the United Kingdom, I don't know. I think sometimes I can be a bit idealistic about what students want. I'd like to know what they should want, but they are putting themselves into significant debt, right? They're putting themselves in significant debt, already making themselves quite precarious. And if it was a route to try to remove them as agitating for social change and for disrupting, it's been incredibly useful, I think.
If I could just follow up, I would welcome case studies, examples of successful academic environments and how they did it. We belong to ASHE, however you pronounce that, and there's some wonderful success stories in there, but I'm not sure if the management side of it is getting shared with people, and maybe something could be shared. How to do this? What are success models? Thank you very much for your responses.
Thank you, Seth. And we have just a few more minutes, so I'll spend the time just thanking everyone. I think this ended up being even more interesting and resonant than I could have even hoped for. So this was really great, and to have such a wonderful turnout from all over the world. So thank you, Blake, and thank you, James, for your work and activism and participation. I'll just circle back to our organization as we end and share some helpful links. You know, our hope is that we have as many people doing climate education activities during the first week of Earth Month as possible. So all the relevant information is here in that link I just sent out, and we will send it out in follow-up emails along with the recording. I think one of my takeaways from today in terms of the US context is that the censorship largely resides in ourselves and our perception of what the punishment pushback can be. So that should give us good a feeling of protection and inspiration that we are in a context in which we can do something, and we should thus feel inspired to, because a lot of people around the world don't have the resources and access to influence that we do here in the United States. And I think James's note really resonates with our work in terms of the importance of interdisciplinary learning and practice, and that the solutions, whatever solutions means for something as huge as the climate crisis, is going to require an engagement of all disciplines, including those of us in the humanities and economics, and of course sciences, business, art. So there's not going to be a silver bullet, but it requires all of us. We are going to stay on for a few minutes past the time, and in case anyone wants to hang out and chat with us about our program. But with that, I think our official webinar with our discussants is over. We'll be sending out helpful links from the chat, from our work, and the recording afterwards. So thank you all so much for being here.
Remember about next week.
Oh, yes. And next week, we have another webinar with folks from Wild Hope who make educational documentaries and materials for you to use. They'll be sharing about their approach. Here's the link for that. Thank you, David. We'll also email that out. So we will stay on, David and I from our program will stay on for a few minutes to chat, but thank you everyone so much. This was really great, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you for the speakers for fabulous presentations, and for everybody, both in the chat and in the conversation, for such engaging and thoughtful discussion of a really tough issue. And thank you for all of your work in fighting for climate education.